For this lecture, we're going to be looking at the philosopher Immanuel Kant. Now, Kant is one of the most important philosophers in the Enlightenment tradition. And in fact, every philosopher that comes after Kant really needs to go back to Kant and deal with some of the problems that he highlights in philosophy. And in this lecture, we're going to be very briefly looking at a few of his big ideas. So specifically, those ideas come from three important works that will really represent the basis of this lecture. The first two of those works are the Critique of Pure Reason and the Critique of Practical Reason. This is where we get his philosophy of science, him trying to reconcile the rationalist tradition with the empiricist tradition. And in doing so, he's actually trying to save science from specifically the empiricists. Now, this sometimes seems counterintuitive because it would be natural to think that science comes out of the empiricist tradition. Kant sees some tension between the empiricist tradition and science, and so we'll look at that. And this is also where we get his distinction between what he calls the phenomenal world, which is really the world of perception, that would be one way to look at it, and the noumenal world, which is the world of the thing in itself. That's where objective reality exists, and so we'll look at the distinctions that he brings up there. And then toward the end of the lecture, we're going to be looking at Kant's moral philosophy very briefly, which comes out of the groundwork of the Metaphysics of morals. But to begin, Kant is an Enlightenment philosopher, and he actually gives a definition for what it means to be enlightened. So to be enlightened, according to Kant, is just to dare to use your own reason. So to try to figure out the answers to life's questions using reason and not some other means. He comes out of the rationalist tradition, so he's very much influenced by Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz. But he's also influenced by the later empiricists, and most notably, he's influenced by David Hume, who is said to have awoken him from his dogmatic slumbers. In fact, that's what he says. Hume woke me from my dogmatic slumbers. And so to begin, I think it would be important for us to look at what Kant means by that. So if we go back to Hume's, the lecture that we had on David Hume, and specifically Hume's problem with causation, which really stems from this question, why would I believe in causal relationships? Well, the best way that I know to illustrate this problem is to think of a pool table. So on a pool table, if you see that the cue ball is moving, and we might call that event A, and then followed by event A, you see the 8 ball moving, we can call that event B, we would be tempted to think, and in fact the common sense intuition is to say that the cue ball, or event A, caused the 8 ball, or event B, to move. This is our common sense notion of causation. And so if we think about this notion, really this notion gets back to the whole idea of motion. How does motion work? This is a long philosophical question that has been asked in the West. Well, in the case of the pool table, event B is the event where the 8 ball moves. How did event B happen? Well, we want to say the cue ball hit the 8 ball, which is to say that the cue ball is event A, and that is the cause of the 8 ball moving. But now if we ask the question, how did event A happen? Well, this might get us close to understanding why there's a problem of causation, as Hume was pointing out. Because if you think of event A happening, why did the cue ball move in the first place? Well, there was probably somebody who was playing pool, and so the person who was playing pool had to make a decision to hit the cue ball with the pool stick. Well, now, when we're talking about the notion of causation, we're talking about the notion of choice. So there was a person who chose to hit the cue ball. And so we could ask the question, does choice happen without a cause? Is there such a thing as causation that happens in my brain, in my mind, where I'm hitting a cue ball, that happens without a cause? Or is it sort of the first cause of its own event, action? And when you ask the question that way, maybe we'll start to see some of the problems that Hume has with the notion of causation. So when we talk about choice, we're talking about what's called agent causation. In other words, there's an agent, usually we're talking about a person, so that there's a personal agent who is making a choice to hit the cue ball. Well, in that case, you have an agent who is the first cause of motion, the first cause of an action, the first cause of an event. Well, there is something sort of mysterious about that, and we can talk about that more when we talk about some mind-body issues later on toward the end of the semester. But when you think about the whole notion of agent causation, that is a mysterious thing, that I can make a choice. Maybe I want to make the choice for my arm to go in the air, so I make the choice for my arm to go in the air, and then an event happens. Well, if agent causation seems weird, what Hume is pointing out is just causation in general seems weird. Now, we infer causation all the time. So when you see a cue ball hit the 8 ball, you assume and you infer that the cue ball was the cause of the 8 ball moving. But what Hume wants to point out as an empiricist is that you don't observe the causal relationship. You infer it in your mind, in your thinking, but you don't actually observe the causal relationship. And it was this problem that woke Kant from his dogmatic slumbers. Because for Kant, he argued that the concept of cause and effect is actually essential for science. He wants to save science from Hume, from the empiricist tradition, because he believes that Hume is correct in his statement of the problem of causation, and he agrees with Kant, or with Hume, that if you start with the empiricist presuppositions, then it follows that there's no account for causation. But if there's no account for causation, then you have no justification for doing science. And so in other words, Kant is really saying that we need both rationalism, or at least aspects from the rationalist tradition, and aspects from the empiricist tradition together for science, because it actually takes a conceptual framework to do science. And so, in his Critique of Pure Reason, he writes that though all of our knowledge begins with experience, so this shows how he's being influenced from the empiricist tradition, it does not follow, according to Kant, that it all arises out of experience. And it's really the second clause where he's getting the rationalist tradition. So how does Kant try to bridge this divide? Well, we can think about the notions of a priori knowledge, which is knowledge that exists independent of experience. That's the rationalist tradition. And a posteriori knowledge, which is knowledge on the basis of experience, which is the empiricist tradition. So if you think about these two different aspects of obtaining knowledge, say we're talking about the knowledge that we get of a tree, well, certainly everything that we know about a tree would be on the basis of experience. So the things that we know about trees, we know through through the sense data that we get, so that's a posteriori knowledge. But if we think about how trees grow, if we think about how trees die, or how they change, we're bringing in a lot of a priori knowledge according to Kant. And that's something that you could think of sort of as our interpretation of the facts of nature. So we don't just have sense data, we also have this interpretation, or this worldview perspective on nature that helps us make sense out of our experiences that we have in the natural world. So Kant really divides our understanding of things into two worlds. You have the noumenal world, which are the objects in themselves, such as the object of the tree, and then the phenomenal world, which is really the world of our perceptions. That's where we try to make sense out of the world that we observe. And when it comes to the notion of cause and effect, Kant argues that we cannot know cause and effect in the nominal world. And this is actually where he's agreeing with David Hume. We have no empirical observation of causal relationships. But he says we do know cause and effect in the phenomenal world. And that's actually the world that matters for science, according to Kant. We could think of other notions that we have, such as the notion of goodness, and this will relate to Kant's moral philosophy that we'll talk about here in a moment. But when it comes to, say, the notion of goodness, goodness is also something that we don't observe in the physical world with our five senses. We observe particular acts that happen, such as people serving lunch in a food kitchen. We don't see the goodness of that action. We just see the action in and of itself. But in the realm of our perceptions, we, according to Kant, know goodness here. So we have an interpretive experience of goodness, which is how we interpret the physical event or the social event of serving in a soup kitchen. And really what Kant is saying is that we have access to the phenomenal world, but we have no access to the noumenal world. And that doesn't just come for concepts like goodness or concepts like cause and effect. Actually, what Kant is pointing out is we don't even have empirical access to the noumenal world. Because we don't know whether or not our perceptions actually line up with the way that the world actually is. All we have access to is the phenomenal world, and that is the world that we need to be concerned with when we're concerned with knowledge, or when we're concerned with science, or anything related to philosophy. So another way to think about the distinction between the phenomenal world and the noumenal world is to think of a pair of glasses. I think this is helpful. So you can think of sort of a worldview perspective that you might have. The noumenal world is the world in itself. According to Kant, we have no access to that, to the thing in itself. All we have access to are the perspectives that we bring to the world. So the perspectives are like the glasses that we put on when we observe the world around us. And all of our glasses that every person puts on has a certain tint to it. And so we see the world through the tint of that glasses, through the tint of our experiences, and that's how we interpret the world around us. And we never can get outside of that perspective that we bring to every situation. And so Kant says we should reject the assumption that knowledge involves conforming our concepts to the objective world. This is kind of a traditional way, and this is actually a huge shift in Kant's thinking, a shift that everyone needs to deal with after Kant. So the huge shift is that traditionally philosophers have thought, if we're talking about any philosopher other than, say, the sophists, we want to get our concepts of the world to line up with the way the objective world actually is. And to the degree that our concepts match the objective world, that's to the degree that we know something. Kant, however, says that it's just the opposite. Knowledge involves conforming the objective world, which we have no access to. It involves conforming the objective world to our concepts. That's what it means to know something. We don't want to get our concepts to line up with the objective world because we have no access to that. Rather, we're trying to understand the world through the lens of our philosophical worldview. And he argues this really because there's no way to take off the glasses. Humans, according to Kant, are by their very nature subjective. To be human is to be subjective, Kant might say. You can't get outside of your own experience, and so why try to get an objective access to the world around us when there is no such thing as objective access to that world? So, from this then, Kant formulates what he calls categories of understanding. So these would be categories like the notion of cause and effect, the notion of induction, even the notion of space and time. These are all categories that we use, and we sort of have these categories a priori. So this is the rationalist part of Kant, where we can't help but think according to cause and effect. We can't help but think in terms of spatial relationships, in terms of time. I mean, when you're counting, you're counting through time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. Every time you say another number, you're going through time. And so these are categories that we bring to the world, and he just says our minds can't work any other way. And so this is the rational aspect of Kant.